Good Friday morning. Welcome to Begin in the Word. Today we'll be continuing our study in the book of Titus, looking at Titus chapter 1, verse number 6. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Now you may notice this doesn't actually feel like a whole, entire, full sentence. And in fact, it's not. It's picking up on the last of what we read in our last episode, verse number 5. So if you haven't watched Titus chapter 1, verse number 5, I invite you to go back and look at that so you can put these two things together. But I want to break these apart because there's just so much to say in all of this. This text is going to sketch out the portrait of what an elder will be like. An elder, we might say a pastor or a bishop, overseer, or shepherd. What this role looks like and what this sort of person will be like. Titus is supposed to point these in every church or in every city. In every city, he's supposed to point these kind of men. So what kind of men is he looking for? Well, the first thing we'll notice is if a man. We'll read in Titus chapter 2, that our sisters have incredible and irreplaceable impact on the mission of God and the kingdom of God. Our sisters are invaluable. If we lose our sisters, we lose in many ways the heart of the church. However, the men that God, or the people that God has called on to lead, are men. As offensive and difficult to our modern sensibilities as that might be, we need to submit to the will of God. We need to trust the will of God and seek to conform our ways to His and not to try and conform His ways to ours. And so pastors need to be men. The idea of a sister being a pastor is not a biblical one. But more than that, it's not just that a human has a certain kind of anatomy. They have, moreover, a certain kind of character. And that character that overarches much of this is going to be the word blameless. The word blameless will demonstrate and overarch many of the things in the picture and the portrait that we're going to see in the coming episodes. This doesn't mean that a man must be perfectly without sin, but it does mean that they need to have good character and they need to have reputable character. They need to have a good reputation. They need to be thought well of. Now, once again, as well, this doesn't mean that if someone launches a baseless claim against them that they aren't qualified. As we'll see in the coming episodes, for these elders, they need to be able to respond to the threat of false teaching. And so this notion of their reputation is going to be important so that their credibility doesn't come into question, so the teaching doesn't come into question. This is about protecting the teaching, the doctrine of God, and then having credibility in being able to persuade people. There's a lot of places this needs to be demonstrated, but as you'll see for the title of the video, the best place perhaps to begin in this is in the home. And there's two examples that Paul is going to focus on as it pertains to what sort of person can be a good leader, a good shepherd, a good elder. The first thing here is that they are the husband of one wife. They are the husband of one wife. We need to consider a man's marital condition. This is part of his blamelessness. The notion here of one refers to his current number of wives. Contextually, this is requiring marital fidelity to a single woman, and that's mostly uncontroversial. Basically, everybody agrees that marital fidelity to a single person is required in elders. The contention arises around things like divorce specifically, and that discussion is deep and it is impassioned. Specifically, the question is someone who is divorced and then remarried, are they qualified for this, or have they become disqualified by that divorce and more particularly by that remarriage? The short answer that we'll give is not necessarily. Not necessarily is someone disqualified because of that. The first case we'll make is from Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy chapter 4 talks about the bill of divorcement, and it's clear that whenever that bill of divorcement is given, the marriage is ended. To refer to your former spouse as your spouse would be incorrect. They are your former spouse. Someone who is divorced does not have a spouse. So if a person is divorced and remarried, biblically they have exactly one spouse and then however many number of former spouses. However, we do need to remember that while that may be allowable, that condition of a divorce and a remarriage is not an inherent disqualification. We need to remember this condition is about blamelessness. And while a divorce may not be an automatic disqualification, there are things that come into play with this, and that is their culpability into it. For example, were they abusive? Were they a poor husband? Did they have infidelity that's caused this? The behavior surrounding this situation is important, and that's fair game in the examination of that, because the recency and the culpability of that may be factors in his credibility. And so this calls for men to be examples in their home who have good, strong character as they serve their wife. If a man cannot be a Christ-like servant to his wife, he certainly will not be a Christ-like servant to the church. And being a husband here is saying that they need to be a husband who shows those qualities, who serves like Christ serves. And one of the first places you can see that, and many of the other attributes that we'll read in the next time, is how do they do it towards their wife? Because how they do it towards their wife, and then as we'll see in a moment, towards their children, is going to be absolutely a reflection of how they're going to do it towards the church. And so we have the idea of the husband of one wife of marital fidelity. Further, we have this idea of faithful children. And this is another one that raises important questions. We read that an elder must be not just a husband, but a father. Not just a husband, but a father. Men who do not have children, who do not have wives, cannot be biblical pastors, and we should not give them that title. Moreover, it says that their children must be faithful, which raises a lot of questions. What is meant by faithful? Now, some have argued, and some translations even say children who believe, or children who are believers. And some have said that if a person's children are not saved, they're not Christians, they're not baptized, then they are not qualified. However, I want to note a complementary passage that appears over in 1 Timothy chapter 3. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, it reads that a man who's a candidate for an elder must manage his own house well with his children in submission, because if he can't lead his home, he can't lead the church, and I'm paraphrasing there. But if we compare that, the list in 1 Timothy 3 with the reason here, the children must be in subjection. Why? Because if you can't lead your home, you can't lead the church. We compare that list, and then we compare these two things here. They've got to have faithful children, and then we have what's in a positive phrase or a restatement of that. What does it mean for a man to have faithful children? Well, that's the sort of children who are not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Now, in a positive phrase is another way of restating the same idea. In this case, he's stating, what does it mean to have faithful children? Well, it means they're not accused of dissipation or insubordination, or we might say drunkenness or rebellion. They can't be those sort of people. And that seems to line up with that idea of having children in submission. If Paul wanted us to get across that the children of pastors, of shepherds, of elders must be Christians themselves, this seems a poor way to communicate that fact. It seems a poor way to communicate that fact if he's going to just list as what does it mean for them to be that? It means they are not accused of drunkenness and rebellion here. Further, we want to know a quick word about this word faithful, and I know we've circled it a lot to where it's become unreadable, but the word here, faith or faithful children, can more generally mean faithfulness or fidelity, and it can have another person as its object rather than God. You'll see places about people being faithful to people who are not God. It just means to have fidelity. And so it seems the translation here that we should have is a man who can manage and lead his children. And beyond the notion of leadership skills is their ability to do this, their ability to show that to outsiders as well, and to maintain that credibility to insiders and outsiders. Because if a person can accuse them for their failings as a father, they're going to reject this message. An elder who tries to speak on family, which is part of what Titus is going to be talking about later in chapter 2, who's had total failings in this, is going to have no credibility, and he won't be able to teach sound doctrine in that way. And so he's not going to be the kind of person who can take the teachings of Titus and carry them forward as a central component of chapter 2. And so as we think on this, our homes, our families are of major importance to God. This is really the central component of all of chapter 2. chapter 2 of the book of Titus, is how do we have families that honor God? And here it seems that as you pick out an elder, he needs to be someone who's had success in this area. He knows how to lead and to manage his children, how to deal with the difficult years as a young child, and also the difficult teenage years when they begin to push the bounds. And that sort of thing, that leadership skill and that credibility, those ideas of example, of delegation, of training, of fairness when there's disputes and disagreements, of service, of dealing with sin, of counseling, and all those things that go on in our homes, those are just microcosms of what go on within the church. The idea of being able to control your temper because whenever your child is in a disagreement is the sort of thing you need to have in the church. And so if a man wants to be an effective leader in the church, he needs to get his hands messy and begin to lead at home. For that is where that will begin to be displayed and shown. Thank you so much for joining us today here at Begin in the Word. It's our prayer that just as you've begun today in the Word of God, you'll live out today in the Word of God.